On July 22nd, 2022, the biggest event in wrestling occurred. Vincent Kennedy McMahon stepped down from his role of CEO at age 77 from the WWE. He had been the CEO for the WWE for the last 40 years. So basically, anyone who watched wrestling or knows about wrestling knew about wrestling because of him. And now, suddenly, at age 77, he stepped down. Now, some people might not know who Vince McMahon is because they don't really know what pro wrestling is, because they don't really watch it. Just know that you might actually know him from other sources outside of pro wrestling. There's a meme format of him getting more and more excited in each subsequent image, which you might have seen before. Yeah, that's the guy. And the context for why he gets more and more excited is because he was getting a striptease on live television inside a wrestling ring. Yeah, this man is a weird man, which is why him stepping down was big news. Also, the fact that he stepped down isn't because of him wanting to retire, it was due to outside circumstances that he didn't have complete control over. We'll get to that. But first I'm going to tell you exactly how insane the idea of him stepping down and actually losing his position as CEO due to a scandal really is, because in the eyes of many people who understood wrestling and understood Vince McMahon, people thought he was going to be there for life. Until he could not physically function anymore, he was going to be the CEO for the company. But apparently, that's not happening. Now let me explain why people thought that. You see, ever since becoming the CEO of his company, he slowly but surely made his wrestling company the biggest wrestling company in the entire world. Back in the 70s and 80s and 60s and whatnot, wrestling was divided up into territories. And basically the rule was, you stay in your territory and you don't expand. Vince McMahon, however, decided to expand. And as you would imagine, breaking this one rule caused him a lot of ire from the other wrestling territories, who all saw him as now the competition and as the enemy. He received hate mail, people not wanting to work with him anymore, even death threats at times, but still, he persisted and he continued doing his thing. Eventually, he was able to buy up all the wrestling territories in North America and became North America's pro wrestling company. There was other companies, but they were small indie companies that really didn't act as much competition. Though to be fair, during the 90s there was another company, and the 80s there was competition there too, and he of course struggled to become number one, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about his craziness, and just, Vince McMahon's goal to break the one rule, and wind up winning and beating all other wrestling companies. Even though they adamantly tried to oppose him, they failed, and he still became the guy who owned pro wrestling in North America. Now, it's wrong to say that WWE is the only major pro wrestling company in the world, because especially with AEW coming across the last few years, and New Japan always being around the corner. But at the end of the day, even these two companies aren't nearly as big as WWE, because here's the thing. When someone talks about pro wrestling, they often, at least in my personal experience, won't go, oh, that pro wrestling thing. They'll go and say, oh, that WWE thing. And what's the difference between amateur wrestling and that WWE wrestling kind of thing? So, in the minds of most people, when they think of pro wrestling, they just think of WWE. And that's because of Vince McMahon. Now, to become the biggest fish in the sea, it takes a lot of work, and it takes quite the mindset to do so. And Vince McMahon sure does have a unique mindset. Here's some of the wacky things that, Vince McMahon is known for. So, first off, Vince McMahon hates things like sneezing. He feels like it's someone's weakness or something. He absolutely hates it when someone sneezes. He looks at people with fury when they sneeze. Maybe it's a sign of, I don't really know why, but I'm assuming it's because it's like a sign of weakness that he doesn't like to see. Because it's like something your body can't control, and he hates not being in control of things. Maybe that's a reason why he hates sneezing. I don't know. Another thing is that he really doesn't like to eat or sleep. If he could, he would never eat and sleep ever again for the rest of his life. Like, he's known to just eat food for the sheer purpose of nutrition, not for the pleasure. I've been told stories where he'll just have this sandwich of a giant stack of sliced deli turkey in between two slices of bread and just, you know, chomp, chomp, swallow, try and get it down as quick as possible. He is a weird man when it comes to dieting. He has this thing for burritos, but he calls them meat wraps, and he doesn't actually know the fact that burritos are called burritos. He always called them as meat wraps. The way he would eat his breakfast, lunch burrito things would be like, it would just be like slices of steak and egg doused in ketchup, and then he would just, again, 2 bites and try and swallow it, get it down to his system as fast as possible. He really doesn't like the idea of eating and consuming, and wishes that, he didn't need to eat, which is strange, but there are other people exist that wish they didn't need to prepare meals and eat and everything. So, maybe that's not too weird. Another weird thing is how much he wants to work out, especially considering the guy's 77. This is how this guy looks like when he's 77. He's jacked. He works out like at 2 a.m. in the morning. It's insane. It's like he's trying to fight old age by just pumping as much iron as possible. Which, good for him though, but still, that's some mental fortitude to work out that early in the morning for that old of a guy. Especially with a guy who's got history when it comes to injuries and surgeries. Another thing that people mention Vince McMahon is known for is the fact that he absolutely only watches pro wrestling. And more specifically, he only watches his company. He doesn't really bother watching his competition. He doesn't really bother scouting for indie wrestlers that have a lot of potential. That's for other people to do. He really never really, unless someone shows him specifically a video of a pro wrestler, he's not going to really know about them unless they're working for his company already. And when it comes to watching pro wrestling, that's all he watches. He'll only watch his content, allegedly. It seems like people mention how he's never watched a TV show since the 70s. He's never gone out to watch movies, really. He's just, while working out or in his office, he'll just have, his wrestling shows being played in the background and just watching that. Now, these quirks aren't just outside of wrestling. He has many quirks that apply to wrestling and has actually affected pro wrestling today because, he's the creator of the biggest company in the world, so what he says goes. So, for example, he doesn't like talking about championships as belts. He doesn't like them to be referred as belts. So instead of it being, give me that gold belt or that gold strap or whatever, they'll talk about the championships. They have to go, I demand a championship match, not a title shot, not a wrestling match, but a championship match. And it's surprising for the guy who's really only known for pro wrestling. He absolutely hates the idea of people calling his pro wrestlers pro wrestlers. They call them sports entertainers. They're not pro wrestlers, they're sports entertainers. To be fair, it's a bit of a marketing scheme, an idea that the company is bigger than just pro wrestling in itself, and his superstars aren't just pro wrestlers, but, superstars. They're grade A actors, well known on the big screen TV kind of deal. In fact, the company name actually reflects his mindset. The WWE, then known as the WWF, used to be referred to as the World Wrestling Federation, then became World Wrestling Entertainment, and now the World Wrestling Entertainment is now silent. So it's just, it's WWE. They don't refer to it as the World Wrestling Entertainment anymore. It's just referred to as WWE, which paints quite a clear picture of how Vince McMahon views pro wrestling and how he views his company. He wants to be more than pro wrestling, even though he's pro wrestling. I don't know. He's also known to have a very strange sense of humor, and he'll often use that strange sense of humor to book and decide a lot of pro wrestling matches and feuds and rivalries and storylines. For better or worse, they are a thing. Now, that's not to say that, he's a complete strange wacko, because, again, he's the creator of the pro wrestling company that everyone knows of. He beat all the other wrestling territories. He knows, for the most part, what he's doing. It's just that he has these Vince McMahonisms and these rules that some people find rather jarring and a lot of people find a bit limited. It should also be known that in pro wrestling, he paints himself as the big, terrible dictator bad guy for the company bad guy who got beat up by the company's biggest, by pro wrestling's biggest hero for the entertainment of the masses. He's had some really weird storylines, such as his weird storyline in which he, you know, cheats on Linda McMahon, his wife, and beats up his son and terrorizes his daughter a lot. And then he also tried to push for some incest angles in the past, both with his daughter and both for his son and his daughter together. Obviously, they never panned out, thankfully, but some weird angles such as his daughter being kidnapped by another pro wrestler and being forced into a marriage and given, roofies, that was a storyline that existed and has actually worked out rather well because due to that storyline and having to work together, the two people involved, Vince McMahon's daughter Stephanie McMahon and the wrestler Triple H, actually formed an actual intimate relationship, which is, upon reflection, kind of weird. But it's actually a very solid and stable relationship, and both of them love pro wrestling, and it's great for the company. So you know what? It's panned out pretty good, I guess. Huh. So obviously, a billionaire that's willing to get beat up and bleed on live TV has a few screws potentially loose, and these potentially loose screws have got him in trouble in the past. For example, the Owen Hart situation. On May 23, 1999, on a pay-per-view called Over the Edge, Hart was supposed to be lowered down by a harness and a grappling line into the ring. However, the harness that was meant to keep him in place was rather simple in design, and on the day of the pay-per-view, it accidentally triggered and released him while he was still in the air. There he fell 78 feet, landing chest first on the top rope and throwing him into the ring. Obviously, upon this occurring, they cut to commercial very quickly and had paramedics try to bring him to an ambulance and to the nearest hospital. He was very quickly pronounced dead just minutes after. However, WWF and Vince McMahon chose to keep the show running even after they found out about his death, and kept the pay-per-view running till the end of the show, where a bunch of other wrestlers proceeded to wrestle inside a ring in which one of their friends just died. Another controversy was when Chris Benoit committed his crimes. For those who don't know, Chris Benoit was a professional wrestler who, during a 3-day period from June 22nd to the 24th of 2007, proceeded to end the life of his child, his wife, and then finally himself. Now, as terrible as this tragedy is, some of you may be wondering how this relates to the WWE, other than the fact that he was a WWE wrestler. You see, while it's still kind of debated on what exactly caused him to finally snap, the fact that is that a lot of people agree that the steroids and the concussions that he had over the years for pro wrestling did not help matters. Especially considering the fact that the WWE often had, and often did, hand out illegal steroids towards its talent, and also the concussion policy at the time was, well, there wasn't really a concussion policy at the time. It should be noted that the WWE for a long time was known for its rock and roll lifestyle with the drugs and the booze and the long work days and the very few vacations and the working through pain and injuries kind of situation. So, a bit of flack came from that once they found out about Chris Benoit. Though that being said, a lot of these complaints about the lack of proper care for its talent has been around for the WWE for quite a while. Especially considering that all the WWE wrestlers currently signed are known to be independent contractors. However, they're not allowed to go and wrestle for other companies, aren't really allowed to go for commercials or TV shows unless the company gives them the say-so or it's run by the company itself. But the independent contractor means that the WWE doesn't really need to pay for health care or dental care or even pay for the stuff like transportation if they didn't want to. And that's always been a sticking point, the fact that a lot of the people inside an office, a cozy square office, who work for the WWE, were insured, but the people who are wrestling and literally risking their necks out every single time they wrestle don't get the health insurance needed. However, the most controversial and perhaps the closest thing besides the current events that caused Vince McMahon to almost step down from the company was the steroids trials. In 1994, the steroids trials occurred, and the steroid trials were, well, trials regarding steroids. Vince McMahon was under scrutiny by the American government for suspicion of supplying illegal anabolic steroids to his professional wrestlers. Now, this does not come unfounded due to the fact that one of the head WWE doctors at the time was in fact found guilty of handing out illegal steroids to the WWE talent. However, to make a long story short, Vince McMahon was found not guilty on July 23, 1994. But this was such a major penalty that Vince McMahon could have gone in jail if he was found guilty. And even though he did make it out unscathed relatively, the company still suffered. You see, Vince McMahon has a specific type of pro wrestler that he likes. Basically, if you're not over 6 feet tall and weigh over 220 pounds, he's not exactly gonna be interested in you. Now, while there are exceptions to a rule, that is the tried and true rule for the most part. In fact, the company would even add weight and add height to wrestlers' bios to make them sound larger than life. And with the steroids trials, Vince McMahon was forced to veer off from promoting the more larger wrestlers and had to start pushing the smaller wrestlers. And by small, I mean they were all still like 6 feet tall and over 200 pounds, but they're just not 250 pounds and 6'4". It was an improvement, I guess. But that was the closest Vince McMahon was ever to having to be forced to step down. In fact, that was the closest that Vince McMahon would ever serve prison time. This near upheaval for the company was the last real major situation that the WWF and Vince McMahon would ever see themselves in. Again, after this, things like the Owen Hart death and the Chris Benoit situation did occur, and was especially the Chris Benoit situation. Again, drugs and steroids were put under scrutiny, but again, they survived and nothing really happened. That is until the most recent events. More recently, in April 2022, the WWE board began to investigate a $3 million hush money settlement that Mr. McMahon had paid off over an alleged affair with a former employee of the company. This investigation then reviewed other non-disclosure agreements that were related to misconduct claims by other women that worked for the company against Vince McMahon and executive John Laurinaitis. Eventually, it totaled up to $12 million. Though this was not the first time that there had been misconduct claims by Vince McMahon. You see, on April 3rd, 1992, Rita Charlton, a former referee, noted that in her stint for the WWF at the time in the 1980s, Rita Chatterton, who was the first ever female referee to work for the WWF, claimed that on July 16, 1986, Vince McMahon tried to force her to perform stuff with him inside a limousine. He then refused, and then he proceeded to do the stuff with her against her consent. Yeah. Former wrestler Leonard Izutari has corroborated Chatterton's allegation. And then, on February 1st, 2006, Vince McMahon was once more accused for harassment by a worker at a tanning bar in Boca Raton, Florida. Though on March 25th, there was no charges to be filed against Vince McMahon as a result of the investigation that took place. Though these past allegations were brought to the forefront, once these more recent allegations were brought up about Vince McMahon. Though Vince McMahon himself played down the fact of this situation and proceeded to not really care. In fact, the first thing that Vince McMahon did after these allegations began was appear to start off the show on Monday Night Raw and just greet everybody. But it was thought to many people who watched this as some sort of power play, showing that he wasn't very worried about these ongoing investigations. He then proceeded to do the same thing on Friday Night SmackDown, and the next Monday Night Raw. In fact, after finishing one of his speeches, he would return back to the back area and say, F 'em, likely referring to these allegations that were going on. So this continued on for a few weeks. Vince McMahon seemed to still be in charge, booking the shows, running the venues, doing all that, and these investigations continued on, people discovering more hush money being brought here and there. Vince McMahon, however, never seemed to be very much bothered by it. However, on July 22nd, 2022, Vince McMahon went on Twitter and tweeted one thing. At 77, time for me to retire. Thank you, WWE Universe. Then, now, forever, together. Hashtag WWE, hashtag thankful. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Vince McMahon just went to public and said, I am retiring. And no one was expecting this, considering the fact that everyone who was discussing these investigations and these allegations that were going on with Vince McMahon was the fact that, sure, he's probably guilty of it, but you know what? It's nothing illegal that he's done with all the non-disclosure contracts that he's given, and the hush money he's given. It's not illegal, maybe amoral, but not illegal, and you'll probably have someone else be the fall guy. Except that didn't happen. Even though he acted so confident, even though he appeared every single show afterwards confident and smiling, turns out he was forced to step down. And suddenly he left the company, and the responsibility of being a CEO fell down to his daughter, Stephanie McMahon, and another man called Nick Khan. Now, Nick Khan is kind of a strange man when it comes to the world of pro wrestling, because he's only joined the WWE recently in the past few years. This was also around the time where there was a bit of a tonal shift for the WWE itself. The WWE, for the first time after Nick Khan joining, was brought onto the stock market, and it seemed like he was hired to negotiate TV and media deals for the company, and trying to make the company look as marketable as possible for potential buyers. And then suddenly, this new guy and Stephanie McMahon were now in charge. Triple H was also returning and became Triple H. Stephanie McMahon's husband was now given the job to be both talent relations and head of creative for the WWE now, and is now currently running the shows. And with the changing of the guard came the change of how the shows ran, and those changes were spotted immediately by fans who watched the show. Because, again, like I said before, Vince McMahon has a specific way of showing things, and over the years, he's been known to have a few flaws, like a lot of talking, a lot of weird comedy bits that didn't really hit that well, a bunch of weird matches, some weird feuds, some old rivalry and storylines that seemed like they should belong back in the 80s, forgetting a lot of stuff and using certain strange vocabulary to talk about things, and constantly being a control freak over what people can and cannot say whenever they're on screen. Whether it's the announcers, the commentators, or the wrestlers, they had to say specific things, they had to do specific things. But here, now with Triple H here, called the Triple H era, things seemed a bit more relaxed, and people are given a bit more freedom, and strange gimmicks that people aren't really a fan of seem to be going away, and more creative spins on segments seem to be taking place. Overall, the changes have been sudden but very clear, and it seems like it's going for the better. Before, Monday Night Raw, a 3-hour show, felt to many a bit slow and trot. Perhaps it's just because it's slightly newer, but still, it feels like the 3-hour show is a lot more digestible and enjoyable. And a bunch of wrestlers that Vince McMahon either mishandled, fired, or released seem to be coming back to the company and being used properly. People are rather optimistic over the Triple H era because Triple H, again, was a pro wrestler, a successful pro wrestler who has experience in doing this stuff and seems to be a lot more in the know than Vince McMahon ever was. So it feels like, at least when it comes to the TV aspect, the WWE is improving. But who knows what's going on next for the company? Who knows what changes are going to be made after this? The last few years, there's a lot of rumors over what's going to happen to the company. It felt like after being introduced to the stock market that Vince McMahon was seemed to be trying to sell the company to somewhere. But now that he's stepped down and Stephanie McMahon and Nick Khan are both CEO and Triple H having his new vision when it comes to pro wrestling, who knows what's going to happen? Hopefully for the better, but this is uncharted territory for anyone who watches pro wrestling because Vince McMahon's gone and Vince McMahon has always been there. And now that he's gone, it's just mind-boggling because no one knows what's next. Hopefully for the better, but I guess we'll just wait and see. Him no longer being CEO of the company is probably going to impact the world of pro wrestling for a long time. Though that's not to say that he's gone from pro wrestling as a whole. He's still the major shareholder of WWE, except he just can't really call the shots anymore for the WWE. Still, with him gone, a multitude of changes could happen, and who knows what's next. Anyways, I've rambled long enough, so yeah. This is Captain Bill, signing off. See ya.